Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be looking at the latter part of the 19th century and what is often described as the Second Industrial Revolution. We will also, in the United States, look at part of that time period at least and refer to it as the Gilded Age. So, we'll be talking about essentially the big changes that happened technologically and then their impact on business and reactions to the American people over the course of the rest of Unit 6. So, just a little recap. The first industrial revolution was a time period in which we saw a transition from the homespun economy of the colonial era to one in which we see free market principles and the mechanization of labor. Early on, that was focused mostly on the textile industry. We saw different forms of power being utilized in that time. Originally, most of these mills would have run by water power and been built east of the fall line to capitalize on that. By the 1820s and the advent of the steam engine, we will see steam power being used to operate many of these larger mills throughout the American Northeast. We will also see that inventions like the cotton gin, certainly Eli Whitney's usage of things like interchangeable parts, all of these will contribute to a massive shift in the way people manufacture. We will also see a transportation revolution. The steam power that'll be utilized in terms of power for factories will also be used for steamships. We will also see it in the early locomotives of the 1830s and 1840s. We also are going to see within this time period the building of turnpikes, of canals. And so it is a time in which we are seeing labor that used to be done exclusively by hand is being done more and more by machine. We're also seeing that the efficiency in terms of transportation also increasing in that time period. So what makes the first industrial revolution different from the second industrial revolution? Well, part of it has to do with the further mechanization of labor, also the materials upon which much of the change of the latter part of the 19th century will experience. So we will see something called Bessemer steel or Bessemer process steel being created starting in the late 1850s, early 1860s, and you can see a giant forge here on my screen. That steel was far superior to what had existed in the past. Bessemer process, quite simply, removes a lot of the impurities found in iron ore when heated and combined with other alloys. And therefore, you could build the great steamships that we'll see across the oceans. You will be able to build things like the Transcontinental Railroad. Early steel was relatively fragile, especially under duress of cold weather. And so what had existed prior to Bessemer process steel would not have been utilized to build the railroad through the Sierra Nevadas and the upper elevations of the United States because there's a prolonged winter period where the temperatures are well below freezing for an extended period of time. The tracks themselves would have been brittle, they would have broken. The trains would not have been able to travel at high speeds or take great loads. And so Bessemer process steel is going to revolutionize the railroads and the building of railroads pretty much anywhere where man could go. We're also going to see that steel be incorporated in terms of building the city up instead of simply out. Buildings had traditionally been no more than 2 or 3 stories, built of brick or stone. Even the great cathedrals had to have things like buttresses in order to contain the weight as man tried to build up. Steel is going to be much lighter, and it's going to be possible to build multi-story buildings. Early on, 5- and 6-story buildings, but certainly in the latter part of this period, we're going to see buildings that are 20, 30 or more stories tall. That is possible because Bessemer steel, not only is it a product that can take extreme temperatures, but it also can take much greater weights. We're going to see that there's some new energies that are going to be utilized. primarily oil in the latter part of the 19th century. In Ohio and Pennsylvania in the 1850s and 1860s, people found crude oil and began to refine it to make a product called kerosene, which was usually utilized to light people's homes, to heat them. That process of refinement left a byproduct that for a couple of decades no one could seem to utilize, but eventually by the latter part of the 19th century, the 1890s, early 1900s, that byproduct will be further refined into what we call gasoline, which will be utilized by the internal combustion engine, and certainly what will be the automobile of the 20th century. We will also see that by the end of the 19th century, that electricity being used to run factories, to light homes, it was used in an earlier time with the telegraph to carry electric signals over great distances, but it will be also utilized for the telephone in the latter part of the 19th century, and being able to build dynamos that were large enough, substations and batteries to store electricity. That will be crucial in this time period. It's important to understand that electricity as it was produced up through the 1950s would have been produced exclusively with coal-fired plants or hydroelectric plants, so water power. What is nuclear power, wind, solar, those will all come in the latter part of the 20th century. So some other technologies of the late 19th century, people made cloth in the first industrial revolution. In the second industrial revolution, we will see the making of clothes because of Mr. Singer's sewing machine. We will see that people will be able to make multiple copies of items, not in the way that we do with a copy machine or a computerized printer today, but by the typewriter. And you can see a very early version of that. Mr. Edison holding his electric incandescent light bulb. The telephone, probably looking a little bit different than the one you utilize today. Also the beginnings of refrigeration. So refrigeration will come to people's homes in the 1920s and 30s, but it will be utilized starting in the 1870s in rail cars. It'll make it possible to make food production certainly a national endeavor and move food across the country over great distances. And this will be essential as the urban spaces continue to grow and agriculture will have to move westward. So the regional impact we're going to see with the second industrial revolution, for the North, it's going to be a trend that continued from the earlier part of the 19th century. Lots of immigration, continued urbanization, more mechanized labor, more factories, and what had been sort of the rural portions of the Northeast that were utilized for things like food production will become smaller and smaller. The South, right? We talked about the New South and Unit 5. We're going to see that what was the textile industry that was exclusively in the Northeast is going to transition to the South. And if you remember, it was this idea of how do we utilize white labor and not have it working in agriculture, but a more diversified economy where white labor was working in manufacturing. And so much of the textile industry is going to move out of the North and come south to places like Charlotte, North Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia. And that industrialization is going to be something that costs northern factory owners far less money than what they had paid white labor in the North. It also is going to remove some of the issues that came with immigrant labor, the rise of unions that were seen in the Northeast in this time period. The Midwest, it was becoming more and more connected and developing as an extension of the Northeast in the first industrial revolution. That trend continues in the second. We're going to see new cities. Detroit will be a little town up and through the 1890s, but will become, because it's Henry Ford's hometown, become a major industrial center with that Ford Motor Company being built around it in the early 20th century. We will also see cities like Chicago, again, another Western outpost, until the era of the railroad. And certainly once we see the beginnings of the Transcontinental Railroad, that western spur being built, Chicago becomes the hub. And so it goes from the 1840s, where there were a few thousand people who lived in Chicago, that by 1880, Chicago will be one of the three largest cities in the United States. The West is going to become America's breadbasket. It's also going to become a major place for livestock raising, because land is virtually free or very low cost in those areas. And now we can use the railroad to transport foodstuffs hundreds, if not thousands of miles. And so the West, certainly during the latter part of the 19th century, is going to become a place of farmers and food production. We've talked about identity throughout this course, and we're going to look at an American identity, or a facet of it, that is going to increase in terms of its power in the late 19th century, and that will be the idea of the self-made man. If you've ever considered, why has there been this tradition of immigration to the United States? Well, obviously people see it as a place of opportunity. When you look at some of the characteristics of American life, and I'm obviously speaking primarily for white Americans, certainly in this time period, but the idea that there was public schooling of some kind, that one could learn to read through hard work, thrift, sobriety, right, the values of the Second Great Awakening, one could rise above the circumstance they were born into. There will be a whole genre of adolescent fiction written by a man named Horatio Alger that will become very popular. He wrote dozens of books in the last 30 years of the 19th century, and all of them had a protagonist who typically started life at age 12 or 13 with maybe a single parent. The other parent had died, had to give up some schooling in order to go work for the family, maybe as a newspaper delivery boy, or working for a shopkeeper, sweeping up as a stock or something like that. And because he's willing to work hard, at night he goes home and reads, and whatever little free time he has, and just by the nature of the circumstance of the stories, he always comes out as the hero because he helps someone, perhaps as someone who had greater power and influence in American life, or he demonstrated the risks that honesty might bring, and is rewarded and moved up and becomes, an employee, perhaps as in an office, or a manager or something. But always by the end of these stories, he's on the pathway, or has reached his middle 20s as a person who has become successful. So that idea of the self-made man was very powerful. It's still very powerful today. It doesn't necessarily have to be a reality for all people, but the fact that there are people who believe in it, see it, and are motivated to continue to work hard because of it does much to encourage this idea that all people can reach the middle class in the late 19th century, whether that was the case or not. Social class, well, we're going to see some interesting things, because the standard of living is going to continue to rise for the majority of Americans. You're going to see a growing middle class, particularly in terms of management, office work, salespeople. And then you're going to then see a growing underclass that's often filled with people who would have been, by nature or the color of their skin, unable to take on jobs that would be middle class jobs for the majority white population, people who were immigrants. And justification for why this phenomenon happened, why you saw laborers who made relatively little money, and perhaps their job paid less year after year, why farmers found themselves making less money over time. Well, the idea of social Darwinism will become incredibly powerful. If you remember, Charles Darwin did a lot of research in the Galapagos Islands in the 1860s, and he wrote a book called The Origin of the Species, talking about evolution within a species of the many different animals and plants he saw at the Galapagos. Well, those ideas will then extend into people trying to explain sociological and anthropological phenomenon. And a man named Herbert Spencer will begin to write about something called social Darwinism. So that idea, the survival of the fittest, will become a rationalization for why we have the great robber barons or captains of industry, why we have a growing middle class, but then there's this underclass. That underclass must obviously be less fit than their betters. Racial science, all of these things will be intertwined into this idea of social Darwinism. Um, how do you prove that you are the fittest, that you have survived? Well, that feeds into a trend we saw going back to the first industrial revolution, which is that of consumerism. And we still see it today. We make judgments about people's clothing and the cars they drive and the neighborhood they live in, and assume they must have reached some sort of financial success, and often attribute all kinds of intellectual capacity simply because of what we see people consuming. But again, very powerful idea, and we'll see it through much of the literature of the time period. We're going to see the way in which Americans consume change in the second industrial revolution. So my pictures on the screen here, this is Marshall Field's department store. It still exists in Chicago today. I think it's a Macy's now. But the idea that you could go to essentially almost like a palace. They were beautifully decorated. This is just a drawing, but you can go and see in person today the ceiling of the great Marshall Field's department store in Chicago. Still has its Tiffany inlay ceiling that at this point I think is nearly priceless if you could even remove it from the building. So you would go and you could do all of your shopping within a single monstrous size building that had multiple departments. I didn't have to go from shop to shop. There would be experts, and usually they hired relatively pretty attractive young women to be sales people in many of these departments to encourage spending, especially by the male population. But that was one, especially in urban centers, that was a possibility. But if I'm living in rural Iowa, how am I going to go shopping? There's no department store near me. There's no big city near me. I've got to go 400 miles to get to Chicago. Well, there is the Sears Roebuck catalog. If you can think about what you can buy, the possibilities are endless on something like Amazon. Well, before we had websites like that, there was the catalog system. Sears was able to sell practically anything that was manufactured through their catalog. And they used the railroads to make these deliveries possible. You can see farm equipment on these pages, but you could buy clothing. You could even buy relatively low-cost jewelry, sheets, towels, clothing for the whole family, all of these things possible. Sears, for about a 40-year period, even sold kit houses. So if you've ever heard the Craftsman house, Craftsman was a Sears brand. You could buy the plans you needed. You could then have boxes shipped to your current residence or to where you plan to build the home. That would be the pre-cut wood and material you would needed, and then instructions in order to build it for somewhere between about $1,200 and $3,000. And still many of those homes exist in the United States today. We also are going to see in this time period the emergence of what we would consider modern advertising. You're going to have national and global brands come to be, like Coca-Cola, and you are going to see what is sort of the infancy of psychology be utilized to encourage people to consume. The characteristics of capitalism of the Gilded Age. So I said that both those terms can be often used interchangeably. And part of the reason they can is that certainly from about 1860 to the early 1900s, you see a handful of people who, because they are the early investors or creators of these new technologies, they are able to capture the market and become very wealthy. And that wealth becomes very much conspicuous consumption. If you've ever been to the great Biltmore estate in Asheville, which belonged to the Vanderbilt family, you can see how some people had large amounts of money. You can go to Newport, Rhode Island, the great cities of places like Manhattan and Chicago. Some of those mansions still stand today. And the people who built them had so much money in part because it was laissez-faire. There was no taxation for incomes nationally. This is long before the 16th Amendment. So you see what Mark Twain, the author, began to call the Gilded Age. And it's this idea that when we look at the penultimate rise of a civilization, we often call it a golden age, the Republic of Rome, what we would see as the Renaissance in Italy. But he argued that what was happening in the Second Industrial Revolution wasn't showing the United States as being in part of a golden age, but he said it's a gilded age. And to gild means to cover something with a veneer of gold. So if I picked up my coffee cup and put gold leaf on it, yes, it looks like a golden coffee cup, but it's not a coffee cup made of gold. And in fact, I can scratch at that surface and very easily pull away that gold leaf. And Mark Twain was saying that when you really begin to look closely, you can see that there's lots of problems in these urban centers, great poverty. There's a big difference between have and have not. And those were all problems that needed to be addressed and weren't being addressed effectively. So he characterized it as a gilded age, and the term has stuck. We are going to see certainly exploitation of labor because it is laissez-faire. The government is not going to have set minimum wage. They are not going to have minimum or maximum work hours. And so you are going to see, particularly amongst immigrant populations, desperate people will work for nearly any wage. And you can see as there's a steady stream of people who are leaving their lands for more opportunity in the United States, that labor, commodity labor, of this time period is being paid less and less year over year. You're also going to see the rise of monopolistic practices, either through what we call vertical or horizontal integration. In vertical integration, you want to control the raw materials, the distribution of those raw materials to your manufacturing centers. You control the manufacturing process and then the transportation of that final product to the consumer and its direct sale to the consumer. You don't use a third party to do that. Horizontal integration was this idea that you want to get rid of any kind of competition in your part of the market. And so you will either undersell or buy out your competition so that the consumer has no choice but to buy your product. We also see the rise of trust in that time period as well, where you might have companies that have nothing to do with one another directly, like John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, J.P. Morgan's Northam Securities, but they might own portions of one another in order to continue to support one another against what might be potential rivals in the marketplace. Pretty much all of these are illegal today. Vertical integration is allowed to a certain extent, but certainly horizontal integration and trusts are gone. We're also going to see that within the factory floor, the corporation itself, greater industrial organization. And that's going to come by way of a man named Frederick Taylor, who at Harvard is going to begin to teach about scientific management, taking scientific principles, measuring inputs and outputs in order to find the greatest profit. He found that many factories that he visited, people used rule of thumb, what had been the historical precedent, but didn't really look at, in terms of division of labor, how best to utilize workers. Didn't consider that sometimes a factory would be better off running 24 hours a day versus running 12 hours, shutting down and reopening again. Again, the purpose of this scientific management or Taylorism is, in the end, you are making more profit, especially for the corporate structure in which you have fiduciary responsibility to provide profits for your investors. We also will see the rise of middle management, managers observing and maintaining the greatest productivity of the workforce, but then also managers who manage those people and their output. We will see de-skilling. So as machines become more sophisticated, individual labor does not have to be as experienced or is not as sophisticated. My picture of this is Gustavus Swift's disassembly line in his meatpacking plant in Chicago. But a butcher who is highly skilled and has had years of training can turn what is a cow into probably somewhere between 400 to 500 pounds of meat for consumers in about 3 days. And you have to be a pretty strong person. It takes a lot of skill to be able to do that. But through machines and a moving assembly line, Swift was able to take people and teach them one single task, not even really a skill. And by moving that product pretty rapidly and having multiple workers who engaged in different tasks, he could process a pork carcass or a beef carcass in a matter of minutes, and was literally providing meat at relatively low cost to people all across America by the late 1870s. That disassembly line that Swift developed, it will be utilized by Henry Ford about 40 years later. And in this case, it's not to take something apart, but it is to put something together. Why we see the advent of the automobile becoming so popular at the dawn of the 20th century is because Henry Ford applied these same practices to building cars. He knew that if he could have the machinery and a large workforce, but that had limited skill, he could cut costs. Cars, until Henry Ford came around, for the most part, were built by hand. And so his goal was to create a low-cost car, and he was going to do that by his factory floor having greater efficiency. We speak about the people who are the great leaders, certainly the wealthiest people of the time period. If we think well of them, they're captains of industry. If you think about the captain of a ship and that leadership position, if we are judging them for what we see as callous or unfair business practices, a lack of empathy at times for their workers, they are often called robber barons. Some of the most famous of those in railroads, J. Gould Cornelius Vanderbilt, who made one fortune in controlling steamships, particularly in the Atlantic, in terms of transportation, and will build a second fortune after the Civil War in the eastern portion of the United States for individual transport on train lines. We'll also see Leland Stanford, who was the director of the Union Pacific Railroad, continue to build subsequent, particularly north and south going rail lines across the western part of the United States. And some of those names may sound familiar. There's colleges today named after them. So you can see that at least some of their money went to more philanthropic endeavors, particularly in terms of higher education. We will also see in the Second Industrial Revolution an entire revolution within the financial services industry. So if you wanted to pay for large infrastructure projects or develop your corporate structure in the first part of the 20th or 19th century, you had to go get your loan in Great Britain or in France or Germany. There was no bank in the United States after the early 1830s and the calamitous end of what will be the bank war and the national bank, that you could get that kind of financing. So two individuals are going to be responsible for reshaping and basically building a financial industry in the United States. J.P. Morgan came from a family that owned an insurance company in Connecticut called Aetna. He will spend his early 20s working in England, investing his father's money, learning banking principles, and by the mid-1870s returned to the United States and with his father set up the Morgan Bank. His bank lives on today. So JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, the investment firm, they are all of the babies of the great Morgan Bank. But JP Morgan's going to be responsible for investing in technologies like Leland Stanford's railroad enterprises and creating something called Northern Securities. He will invest in Thomas Edison's work with electrification and create General Electric. He will amass enough money, enough cash on hand, that he will be able to buy Andrew Carnegie's steel company in 1900 for $1 billion cash, and control lots of different industries through his financial support. He also is going to be responsible for helping the United States government through 2 economic crises, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the course. But by 1913, the Federal Reserve, the principles by which it runs, all are inspired by J.P. Morgan's thinking. And so he is important, very important to how we look at finance and America becoming a financial capital in the world. Andrew Mellon's going to have similar practices. He is going to be focused heavily in the building of the steel industry. His bank is going to operate out of Pittsburgh, his number one customer being Andrew Carnegie. If you've ever heard of Carnegie Mellon University, that is an endeavor that those 2 men created together. We have 2 great, I guess, titans of industry, if you want to think of them that way, Andrew Carnegie and also John D. Rockefeller. Both of these men are going to control industry. So Andrew Carnegie is going to control about 75% of the world's steel production by 1900 through a process of vertical integration. He will also go on through some of the labor issues that he will have, and perhaps somewhat motivated by guilt, to continue to work on philanthropy in the latter half of his life. Much of his money lives on today through public libraries in the United States, college scholarships, and universities. He will attempt to justify this philanthropy and also the ability to amass a great fortune through an essay called The Gospel of Wealth. And there are some who argue that it does attempt and to some effect motivate other wealthy people like himself to continue to give more money away and be more philanthropic. He also will use the ideas of social Darwinism to defend why he alone should decide how his money is donated and distributed. He was someone who was against the government creating some type of a national income tax. And his argument was that for people like himself, if they didn't start giving it away, the government would simply take it to survive, to solve the problems of society. And last but not least is John D. Rockefeller, who, if we count for inflation, is the wealthiest man who ever lived. He will come from relatively humble circumstances, middle-class circumstances, and get involved in the oil business in his early 20s and realize that with the production of kerosene, it was a commodity, and there were lots of companies producing the exact same thing. And so he will focus on horizontal integration, in particular, the idea of buying up competition so that his monopoly is the only one that is selling oil. And he'll be quite successful at that. By the time the United States government breaks him up in the early 20th century, Standard Oil will control about 95% of the refined petroleum globally. We will see later on in this unit that what are seen as the excesses of the Gilded Age, whether that's through the rise of unions or what will become the progressive movement of the early 20th century, there will be reactions to these new technologies and new business structures that arise at the second half of the 19th century.